welcome to That Implementation Science Podcast, the show that aims to reduce the innovation to implementation gap to 16 and a half years. I'm your host, Mike Pullman, and on today's show, I will interview co-host Kevin King. What? Again with the bro talk? Apologies to everyone in our audience, but look on the bright side. You can use this time again to catch up on old Webster episodes. If you do stick around, we'll talk about the etiology of substance use and substance use disorders, examining training and education of research methods through an implementation science lens, and before you turn off the podcast, just know at the end I'm going to quiz Kevin on his knowledge of Star Wars. I think you'll find today's show to be everything you're looking for in a podcast. Without further ado, let's get started. Welcome, everyone, to That Implementation Science Podcast. I am your host, Mike Pullman, and unfortunately, we do not have a co-host today. I'm very happy to be here today with Kevin King, who is a professor of child clinical psychology at the University of Washington. He earned his PhD from the University of Arizona in 2007. His substantive work focuses on how cognitive and emotional aspects of self-regulation develop across adolescence, and how self-regulation is a determinant of problematic alcohol and drug use. His methodological research focuses on how to improve the quality of data analysis in the psychological sciences. So good to have you here today, Kevin. Are you feeling a little bit nervous about being on a podcast?
You know, I was until you got where I went to graduate school wrong. And now I just feel like there is, the bar has been set low enough. So Arizona State University, I graduated from America's #1 party school in 2007. It's common confusion between this Arizona State and University of Arizona.
How did you find yourself here? I'd love to hear about your career trajectory.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, it starts back when I was a little kid, and I remember getting as a gift one time, maybe from like a Smithsonian gift shop. I grew up around the Washington, D.C. and suburban Maryland, and every summer we'd get to go down to the Smithsonian, and I really feel like it's only as an adult that I've appreciated how amazing the access to the, national museums, that there are in Washington, D.C., they're all free. And, the Museum of Natural History, the Museum of American History, the Smithsonian itself, we could just we'd go on field trips, we'd go in the summers. And my favorite was always the Museum of Natural History. They had the giant elephant that you see when you walk in the big rotunda. They had dinosaur bones. And I was just always fascinated with learning about the natural world. And I remember getting a gift, I think from the Smithsonian, of different rocks. It was just this box with a bunch of different examples of rocks, and they were like glued to the box, and it sort of said what each of them was. There was like soapstone, and I remember, I think the only one I can remember is fool's gold, which I forget exactly what it's called. But it just, I remember looking at that stuff and thinking, man, I would love to be a scientist. I want to learn things. I want to discover things. I was the kind of kid who would read the encyclopedia in our house when I was bored. And I'd like to make a joke and say we didn't have a lot of books, and all we had was one, 1982 encyclopedia. But we did have lots of books, and I was just always drawn to that kind of stuff. And as I grew up, I started getting more of an interest in helping professions. So one of my goals in high school was I had this grand vision. I don't know why, but I had this grand vision of becoming a rural family medicine doctor. It was, for a long time, that was my goal. And then I went to college and realized I was not strong in chemistry, and that maybe the sort of the competitiveness of the medicine pre-med track was not necessarily for me. So at the University of North Carolina, I started studying biology because, again, I was interested in sort of like natural world science stuff. And also that was supposed to be a good pre-med major. But I sort of started souring on that path just because of some encounters in class. I also think I was probably not mature enough to realize that I should really actually study and put in effort to try to get good grades in those courses. And so I took an intro to psychology course and was just captivated. It was one, I got really good grades. I was like, well,
Yeah,
I
it
could do
was much
this.
easier, it sounds like, than
Much
anything later.
easier.
Yes, that's exactly
Yeah,
why
by
I would end
orders
up
of
as well.
magnitude than my honors chemistry class that I got a C minus in, I think. And then I just found myself really being engaged in psychology and thinking, maybe this is a thing for me. So I decided I decided, and it was consistent with other things I was doing. I was a peer counselor in high school. I was a camp counselor, resident assistant. So a lot of sort of like, therapeutic or paratherapeutic roles that I had. And so I finally decided, I think somewhere in middle of my psychology major, that, hey, maybe I'm going to aim for clinical psychology and I'll go for a clinical psych PhD. And again, that was all with the end of being a therapist and learning interventions and doing them. And then I took a course from a brand new professor at the University of North Carolina named Andrea Hassan. And she taught a course on developmental psychopathology. And I was just completely captivated. It was this course about how typical development and factors related to typical development, like temperament or personality and family factors and environments, how that can influence how psychological disorders develop in children and adolescents and young adults. And that course was really rigorous. It was really tough. She was a really tough grader, especially on our writing. But I was really fascinated. And at some point during the class, she asked for volunteers. She said, "Look, I'm doing a research project. If you're interested in learning about research, I'd be thrilled to have more undergraduate volunteers." And I went into a meeting with her to volunteer to be a research assistant. And I've never quite asked her why this happened, but I walked out having agreed to do an honors thesis with her. I think it was probably I was just asking so many questions. She needed to get me out of there, and she just said, "How about we just do an honors thesis and you can get
Maybe
out?"
she was
And
trying to scare you away.
maybe she was. And we had to actually petition because my GPA was too low. We had to petition with the college to let them give me
Oh, wow.
permission. I also like started the honors thesis process a semester late. I started sort of at the end of my junior year, so I spent my I had to agree with her, like I would get the proposal written by the end of the summer. So I spent the summer in the library, like sweating my butt off, making copy after copy after copy of journals because that's what we had to do back in the late 90s, was actually photocopy actual journal articles.
Yeah.
And that thesis was on substance use in adolescents and young adults. And my thesis, I think it was on peer influences. And we were looking at some stuff we didn't find anything, and the analysis were total crap. But I learned about statistical analysis. Actually learned a little bit about regression and moderation and regression in my honors thesis, and had a great time. And through doing that process, I realized, oh man, this data collection and data analysis thing is fun. We can learn things about the world by asking people to, rate numbers on a survey. And that really, and I just thought, at the time, I was probably overly naive about how good we can learn things. But there was just something amazing about turning ideas and words we have into numbers and doing magic with them, and then getting ideas about the world out from there. And I found myself able to sit in front of a computer and do the data analysis and even data cleaning. I found really sort of mesmerizing, and you get in this like flow state when you're doing it. And so I had a really successful, fun honors project. Successful and fun as in like it was engaging, it was enjoyable. We didn't find anything. It was probably in the end not a great research product, but it was a great experience, and I learned a lot. And so after a gap year where I spent time working with children in foster care in Alaska and a volunteer, like an AmeriCorps type position, during that year I applied to graduate school and eventually accepted a position at Arizona State University with Lori Chasson, who happened to have trained Andrea, my undergraduate mentor. And there I followed my research on adolescent substance use and trained for 7 years as a clinical psychologist at Arizona State. And while I was at ASU, I fell in love with quantitative analysis. I sort of continued this sort of gradual path towards being a researcher and away from a full-time emphasis on being a clinician. So there I took stat class after stat class after stats class, and just found myself again just being sort of falling in love with the ways that we can learn about the world and answer increasingly complicated questions about how people grow and change over time and how that growth and change can, lead to or influence the development of substance use. And I sort of found myself increasingly focusing on substance use, sort of merging this developmental psychopathology background with an emphasis on substance use. So I graduated in 2007. I did an internship at Western Psychiatric Institute and Clinic in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And during that year, I applied for faculty jobs because I thought, well, why not? I'll just give it a shot. And I got extraordinarily lucky to have been offered a position at the University of Washington. I'm pretty convinced that all their other candidates accepted jobs elsewhere, and I was sort of the last person standing, but I've never actually confirmed that. I don't really want to know. And I've been at UW studying substance use ever since. I feel like that's probably a long enough answer, so I'll sort of pause there.
Yeah, it's been so nice having you on the show, and I think that's all the time we have for today. So
that's fantastic. I hope I can look forward to writing my own out of office message. So thanks. That was really fun.
It's interesting. I was originally a journalism major and got out of that when I discovered that I hated interviewing people and I was terrible at it. So there's a bit of an irony that we're running this podcast now. Yeah. I was also sort of reflecting on when you were talking about the finding journal articles and having to make copies of them for your mentor. I've done a lot of that, or even did that, and I remember having to go from different copy room to different copy room on each level of the library because there wasn't a journal, bound collection of journal articles in the stacks because somebody else had copied it.
Oh, yeah.
So you have to dig through to find it. And I just remember information felt like it was so much more valuable back then. When you would copy it, I remember I would read it intensely. And now information is so freely available. Do you feel like it's cheapened information at all?
One thing I've learned over the last few years is, you'll see often in grant proposals or papers, people will create a chart that says, interest in topic XYZ has increased exponentially over the years. And it turns out one of the things you need to do with those charts is correct them for the average or typical publication rate in a field, because all journal articles, the number of journals and the number of journal articles that people are producing is increasing also at a logarithmic or geometric rate over time. So, I do think it, I think about that sometimes. I also, though, I balance that with thinking about what we have learned about how replicable or not replicable psychological science is, because I remember that reverence too. I remember the first time I met Susan Ennett, who's a researcher at the University of North Carolina. And I had read a bunch of her work. I think probably the most prominent I had read some of her work on DARE. So she was one of the early researchers to point out that DARE, or drug abuse resistance education, for those of you who did not go through that in high school or middle school, she was one of the first people to point out, hey, it doesn't look like DARE actually works. And we're investing a ton of money in putting police in schools to teach kids about drugs that, for a program that probably doesn't actually work and maybe makes things a little bit worse for kids. And she was actually threatened with lawsuits for her research on DARE, for her meta-analyses on DARE. Wow. And I remember the first time I met Susan, and I was so nervous and shaking. Here's this person, I'd read her research. It felt like, meeting a famous book author, and now I realized she was just, another scientist schlub like me. But as I think about that sort of power of the written word, and I also balance it with thinking about, man, we've learned a lot about how we can mislead ourselves in research over time. So most certainly we were placing probably too much emphasis on the power of those words. And I wonder how much of that research, would hold up today. How much of it is really replicable? How much of it is really sort of solid? On the one hand, maybe it's more solid because there was just less of it, and maybe people were more slower and more rigorous. But on the other hand, I don't know, man. People have always been incentivized to publish as much as they can. So sorry, I'm both like hopeful and cynical at the same time.
No, this is total conjecture, but I do think the field of implementation science, when it originally started, was really focused on the implementation of evidence-based practices. So there was this kind of very positivist understanding, like, okay, we have this program that works and we know it definitely works. And now let's study the factors that were related to its uptake or not. And, this was 15, 20 years ago, before all articles were PDFs and instantly available at the click of a button. And now, again, information is kind of cheapened somewhat. I wonder what influence that's had on implementation science. I do hear people talking less about sort of evidence-based practices and more about just like implementation of a program or idea, whether it's evidence-based or not.
Right.
And a growing recognition that evidence is all probabilistic, and that as we have increasing journal articles, we're having increasing evidence for that probabilistic notion, like a nice distribution of effect sizes.
Yeah.
And it's interesting to think about. I am curious, so you're not an implementation scientist. I asked you to be part of this podcast because I really enjoy hanging out with you, and you have a really great brain and think about things. And we have done some implementation science work in the past.
Yeah.
I'm really kind of curious if you could talk a little bit about ways that implementation science has influenced your work.
Yeah, I mean, it hasn't. I've really benefited not at all from it. I would say the true answer is no. It's done nothing for me, and the reason is that my research is almost entirely on the etiology of substance use and substance use disorder. So the core of my research question, and I'll keep this brief, I promise. The core of my research question is how come most teenagers, young adults, most people, at least in the United States, try drugs and alcohol. Most people try alcohol. I believe a majority of people try marijuana at some point in their lives. Lots of people suffer from alcohol and drug use. Alcohol is a leading attributable cause of death among adults. Alcohol and drug use disorders contribute to massive economic costs in terms of lost productivity and emotional costs and cancers in people. And at the same time, we have this thing where like most people try these things. Most people don't end up having problems from alcohol or drugs, especially marijuana. That's where I focus at least. So we have these things that are pitched as addictive drugs. We have these stories from the National Institutes of Health that addiction is a brain disease. Well, how come most people don't catch this brain disease? What differentiates people over development? In terms of people who are liable and at risk to develop a substance use disorder and people who are not, are there things we can identify early on to predict that risk? And also, how do we understand the progression from early use to a substance use disorder that somebody ends up asking or needing treatment for? Because the other thing is that lots of people, I'm at least convinced that the people who end up asking for treatment are different from the people that you see in epidemiological surveys who might technically meet the criterion for a disorder. So I'm interested in nothing about treatment. It's never been a focus of mine. I don't feel like I have strong expertise in it, at least in research studies on treatment. So that's why I say no, I've been not at all influenced in implementation. But on the other hand, I'm completely changed as a scientist and as a sort of evaluator of research in terms of implementation. So in my own research, for example, a lot of my research in the last, I would say, 5 years or so has used ecological momentary assessment. We send people cell phone surveys a lot, multiple times a day. We're sort of like the annoying friend that's like constantly texting you all day. How are you thinking? How are you feeling? What are you doing? How are you thinking? How are you feeling? What are you doing? And every once in a while, like, hey, have you been drinking lately? And we do research with that kind of stuff. And one of the things I've thought about from an implementation perspective is, well, what do I tell a clinician? What could a clinician do with the work that we do? And, the first answer is probably nothing because all of our findings are tentative and we don't know. But I could say, look, if you're a clinician and you're interested in using the findings that we have from our research, you could ask your patient, and frankly, lots of people do. They already use DBT diary cards, or they have people do thought records. Ask somebody to write down what they're thinking, feeling, and doing once a day, every day for a week, and track it, right? So my research is on self-regulation. So you could ask people to write down how much do you feel like you're acting on impulse right now, and when they're in a moment of high acting on impulse, what are you thinking? What are you feeling? What's going on? Have them track that for a week or two. And come back and look at those situations and say, okay, can we identify a high risk situation where somebody might be at risk for, that my research might point to, where somebody might be at risk for doing something that they sort of would later regret. That's a lot of, what I focus on is like acting on impulse and regretting it later. So I think about my study design as how could you actually, apply my results? So I've avoided more technological solutions like physiological tracking or transdermal sensing of alcohol, because I believe, at least in part, if the scientific question doesn't beg for those technological solutions, I want one that somebody could immediately take my research and put it into practice, at least in a modified way. I also think about that, how implementation is important for my other line of research, which is on how do we get people to use methods and science better. And so, there's been, in the last 10 years, there's been a revolution in thinking about how do we improve the transparency and replicability and credibility of our science. And my view on a lot of those efforts is that they're completely missing the implementation part. That most of the research has been like, let's write more articles and give people more trainings to, help them do better at methods. And the lessons I learned from hanging around implementation scientists, like, hey, that is not going to cut it. And we need to think more systematically and structurally, and frankly, more carefully, to really make a change in the field. And I guess the final way, and again, I guess you should have known this, but you're getting another long-winded answer, and I apologize. I think, the final way is how I review other people's research. When I review grants that are focused on treatment at NIH grant review committees, or when I review research papers, I'm always thinking about, okay, what are the barriers for implementation? How is this solution implementable? Is this something that we can actually, has a hope of being translated, if not now, at some point, into real world interventions? And if I see, what I see are critical hangups in an intervention, or if somebody's doing implementation but not measuring how the implementation goes, that's something I'm going to be calling out in people's research. So I sort of see it as pervasively shifting my worldview about how we do research, and then ultimately also how we train students in clinical psychology programs.
Yeah, I don't know that that the field of implementation science, aside from, I think, the paper that you led, that we'll put in the show notes, has done a lot of thinking in terms of how it disseminates and implements its own information, or how certain fields like methodology and analysis can do that better. I know in that paper you had some really clear recommendations for the field that I thought were pretty interesting. Can you share some of those with our listeners?
Yeah, sure. So the background of this paper was around hanging around a bunch of implementation scientists and thinking, and also getting really caught up in the credibility, replicability revolution in psychology. So my own, my early research was, when I first got to UW, was focusing on impulsivity and understanding how impulsivity is related to substance use. And one of the things I noticed was a lot of people using these impulsivity tasks, like a Stroop task or a go, no-go task in this kind of research. And they were saying, well, this is a way of objectively characterizing impulsivity, because you're getting people to do a computer task. And so I thought, this is great. So I went out and collected 1,000 participants on a bunch of what were, pitched to me as standardized impulsivity tasks. And I was like, I'm going to do this, get a multi-method measure of impulsivity, and we're going to sort of do some factor analyses and show how these things are related and show how it's related to risk for substance use. And I just found jack squat. And I would start bringing this up to...
I hope what you did then is you continued to analyze all sorts of research questions that you didn't ask in the first place, and then present those results as if that was your original plan.
Oh, of course. Yeah, absolutely.
And probably published a lot with that.
Yeah. So. I have never published those data. I have a paper in the works, but I've had a paper in the works for 5 years, or actually more than that, trying to do something with those data. And I would start to go, to conferences and ask people, hey, you're presenting on these impulsivity tasks and you're saying they have these findings, but I tried to do the same thing and I just can't get it to work. What am I doing wrong here? And I would just get shot down and dismissed over and over. And then I started hearing about this problems with replicability in other areas of psychology. And it instantly hit me that, oh yeah, we have the same problem and I've encountered this. So I think, that sort of got me to be really passionate about replicability and open science. And as I started sort of maturing in the field and using more and more quantitative methods in the field, and then teaching quantitative methods, you also start to see this implementation problem where there's just a lot of applications of quantitative methods that on the face of it, like literally reading the paper, they did something wrong. right?
Yeah.
You can tell they're misusing model fit indices, or they're like there's research that shows that like 10% of p-values in published literature are just wrong. And there's always somehow consistently a bias towards significant p-values. Now, sometimes it's just like a rounding error, but there's, it seems problematic that there's evidence across sort of any methodological area you can look at that people misapply and don't understand and misreport statistical analyses. And so as I sort of was noticing that more and more, and as I was learning more about implementation science, I started realizing, hey, wait, these are parallel issues, right? The way I thought about it, at least at the time, was implementation science is saying, hey, we have these evidence-based practices. They're not making it into the field. What do we need to understand and do differently to make things, get these evidence-based practices into the field? And to me, so I wrote this paper for a special issue in the Journal of Abnormal Psychology, called Using Implementation Science to Close the Gap Between the Optical and Typical Practice of Quantitative Methods in Clinical Science. And I actually thought of this paper as even broader, as saying, look, we have this problem in science where our overall methodology is not replicable. There's p-hacking, there's harking, there's poor application of methods. There's just a giant gap between what we say we're doing and what we actually do in our research. And there are evidence-based, practices like methodological innovations that don't make it into practice, or they make it ever so slowly. And then once they actually make it into practice, people just use them as sort of a rule of thumb or heuristic and don't actually think deeply about them. And what people were doing at the time was writing reviews and saying, hey, you're doing it all wrong. You should do it this way. They're writing tutorials and say, here's how you do it better. And I just kept thinking, or they offer workshops. Man, I got to tell you, there's a lot of money to be made in offering statistical training and analysis workshops, just tremendous amounts of money. And I kept thinking, from hanging around you and hanging around Aaron Lyon and Shannon Dorsey, what I would hear from you all, which is, oh yeah, that's called the train and hope model. You give somebody a workshop and you hope they go out in the world and do it better. Or we know that like writing papers doesn't change people's behaviors. And I, frankly, I knew that from my own clinical training and motivational interviewing, that people, even when people know what to do, there's lots of reasons, to make a sort of behavior change. There's lots of reasons why people don't ultimately change their behavior. And so I sort of pulled all those threads together and wrote this paper, along with you and Aaron Lyon and Shannon Dorsey and Kara Lewis, arguing
all the people
that
who just happen to have been folks that we have interviewed on on that implementation science podcast.
Just conveniently, our season 1 roster of guests.
P less than 0.03 for that.
Yeah, and I would say we also purposefully excluded Brian Weiner from that list because he was just too popular and we did not want to bring him on. So sorry, Brian. So yeah, I sort of tried to pull together this idea that like, hey, we have a methodological implementation problem in the field, and maybe we could take some lessons from implementation science to actually improve them. So sorry, that's the whole sort of background of the paper. I'd actually have to look at the paper to see what we ultimately recommended, but I think a lot of it was about thinking about structural problems, was stop relying on individuals, stop relying on training and hoping, and start rewarding methodological research that's not just about coming up with new methods, but is actually about trying to find ways to effectively implement them, to rethink, graduate training in ways that infuses methodological research throughout the curriculum. I think there's often this divide in people's heads between like, oh, I'm not a methodologist, I'm just a substantive person. But if you're a substantive person without sufficient methodological training, you can't even be a substantive person. Because how can you evaluate the research as it's written when you just trust that the authors did everything right, when we know that you can't trust that people did everything right? And even if people are doing everything right, how can you evaluate the literature without appropriate caveats of understanding, well, they took this methodological position and they did this sort of approach at this. How do we know how that compares to other, methodological approaches? For example, using like ecological momentary assessment versus retrospective self-report. Both of those provide valuable perspectives, but if you don't have the methodological appreciation to understand what they can provide, you're going to end up conflating the two and sort of learning less than you can. So I feel like the argument was to um, think about structural and systemic factors and sort of use the implementation science frameworks that are existing to understand why certain methods get adopted and why others don't. And to sort of mostly it was hopefully a call for a lot more research on this, which has not unfortunately happened, partly because I couldn't get funding for it with a few sort of attempts that I had, and I'm not sure anybody's really taken up the charge, to be honest.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's such an interesting question around this sort of systemic reasons why. I mean, I think one of the things that people jump to is, research malfeasance or, cheating. And while that happens, I think probably that's a pretty small proportion of folks
Mhm.
for whom that's the case. And I think some of these systemic issues actually that we discussed recently are really, they create unintended consequences
Yeah,
where
ripple effects, if you will.
people were being rewarded again for papers published, and you're much more likely to get a paper published if you're at that p-value. And then there's just like the standard innovation bias or bias
Hmm.
that people have in their own work. They believe that it works. They believe there's a relationship there. And I think there's some of it is an unintended consequence of really what's kind of a arbitrary line in the stand of p is
Hmm.
less than 0.05, and then people work on different arbitrary lines in the sands rather than really thinking about this as a probabilistic continuum. Oftentimes also without the full understanding of what a p-value even really means. So these are complex issues, and people do really struggle with them, and they struggle
Hmm.
with their application. I really liked what you had to say about ensuring that folks have sufficient methodological expertise that they can at least judge the literature base
Hmm.
when they're doing their own research.
Yeah, I think in my experience, people are desperate for stronger methodological training, and they just don't know where to get it. They don't know how to keep up with what's in the literature, and frankly, the methodologists aren't helping
Yeah.
because they're also focused on and biased towards innovation and putting out a new method, and there's not enough of them who are really the connectors, who are building tools that make it easier for people to do things well. That's why some of the research that my students have done, like Connor McCabe and Dale Kim and Max Halverson, um, and others, a lot of our methodological work has focused on building like shiny apps to do better, visualization of moderation, for example, or writing tutorials like, Jonas Dora has a tutorial that we're working on that shows how to do Bayesian multi-level modeling. And of course, I'm not convinced that tools and tutorials are the only way to go, but I'm convinced that most people don't do things as well as they could because they would if they had the tools and support. Um, but ultimately, even if you care, you have to be in a lab in an environment that rewards that. You have to have a PI or or colleagues that are interested in that. I can't tell you how many times I've proposed, hey, we should think about this more complicated way. And people are just like, no, I don't want to do that. Or like, there's just not support in the research group for it. And you just can't, even if people sort of want to, it feels like an extra huge bar
Mhm.
to do this stuff. So yeah, I fully agree. It's, we need to work on making things more accessible. We need to have more in-person, coaching. I think we need a lot of, and it's just not there.
Well, I see how you deftly sidestepped the debate of how to pronounce primer versus primer by calling it a tutorial. So that was very, very, very adept. So we talked earlier a little bit about some of the work that you're doing substantively. Why don't we revisit that a little bit? What are you currently working on substantively? Give us some more information about that.
Yeah. So I think this long thread of my research has been about trying to understand the roots of the development of substance use disorders. And one of the prominent theories of substance use disorder is what people call the affect regulation pathway. So there's this idea that some people, at least, this goes back to the sort of the 1950s, that some people develop substance use disorders. It's this theorizing started with alcohol use disorders, but then has sort of been generalized to other substance use disorders. That they emerge from people's desire to regulate their emotions, and they use substances to regulate their emotions. Um, and there's with alcohol, for example, there's a tremendous amount of research in the lab that suggests that when people drink alcohol, they feel more relaxed and calm, that there's people self-report that one of the reasons why some people drink is that it helps them feel relaxed. It helps them when cheer them up when they're in a bad mood. There's longitudinal research that suggests that people who report, that kind of those substance use motives drink more and maybe have some higher risk of developing substance use problems over time. And I think it comes from clinical wisdom and clinical lore, where people in treatment for substance use disorders, especially alcohol use disorders, say and have this belief that they, drink to regulate their affect. But there's a missing piece of this puzzle that when you actually follow people in near real time, so at a daily level, you have them fill out these ecological momentary assessment surveys or daily diary surveys. There doesn't seem to be a link between daily negative mood or negative emotions and later drinking. In fact, people who retrospectively report that they drink for coping motive reasons do drink more. And they're more likely to drink and they drink more, even if you measure it at the daily level. So it's not just some retrospective report bias. But what we can't see is this within-person link between how people feel and what they end up doing later drinking-wise, which is especially puzzling because, again, not only do lab studies show that drinking makes people feel sort of less negative mood and more positive moods, which is probably like a no duh, but you can make people upset in a lab. You can induce negative affect, and they're more likely to drink in a free drinking paradigm later. And I don't have any reason to think those findings are not replicable. So we have this weird thing where like there's all this converging evidence for negative affect regulation, except when you ask people what's going on in their daily lives. And so a lot of my research lately has been trying to understand the basics of behavior and emotion regulation in people's daily lives, and understanding gaps between people's narrative understanding of why they do what they do. So we have some research, for example, that shows that people who say they often act on impulse in response to negative emotions, which is sort of a broad generalization of this affect regulation by drinking and by substance use, that they don't seem to exhibit that behavior in real life, although we're working on some replications of that now with larger samples, trying to see if maybe the effect was there, but it was just smaller than we thought. Mm-hmm. But that finding has been replicated by other research groups too. So there's this idea that people have one narrative maybe about their lives that they carry with them that is meaningful and important, but that may not reflect their average daily experience. Maybe it reflects some other aspect of their average daily of their experiences, but not sort of what they're like typically. And we've been looking at that in substance use too. So for example, my postdoctoral colleague, Dora, led this amazing meta-analysis where we wanted to look at this affect regulation hypotheses in diary and ecological momentary assessment, sort of daily life data. And so we first thought, well, let's do a meta-analysis and let's take published studies. But then we realized, well, these are clustered data. Most of the people are either predicting whether or not people drank or how many drinks they drank, and there are not meta-analytic techniques to sort of synthesize regression coefficients for like logistic multi-level regression or negative binomial regression. Plus, everybody analyzed their data differently anyway, so it was like really difficult to do that. Although fortunately, most of the studies were structured really similarly, and they used really similar instruments, so we actually had a lot of harmony there. And part of the goal of this, by the way, was driven by this curious fact that in everybody's introductions, they would talk about affect regulation, and they would always say the findings are actually really mixed in ecological momentary assessment or daily life research. But people would always report null findings. And in fact, if you sort of tabulate the studies, it was very clear that the findings were on average null. But sometimes people would break out an interaction, that was just barely significant. If you squint it, turn it 90 degrees, and you say, oh yeah, the finding is there, but only for these people in these situations. Mm-hmm. And so we thought, well, okay, we can't synthesize the data. And I just said to Jonas, sort of almost offhand, well, let's just ask people for the data and do it ourselves. And we did that, and we got this amazing response from the alcohol research community. We asked something like 70 to 75 research groups about their data sets. I'm getting some of these numbers sort of, maybe it was like 50 to 55 research groups for about 60 to 75 data sets. And almost everybody said yes. we had a few people who said, I would love to share my data, but my university has really stringent data sharing requirements and it's going to take a year. And we said, oh, yeah, no worries. There were others that said, well, I moved and, I don't have access to the data anymore and my PI retired. These are from some of these older studies. I did have one person say they didn't want to share their data with me because I had been rude to them before and they just didn't like me. But aside from that,
I think you need to name that person on the podcast.
I am absolutely not going to name that person because I will absolutely just take their word that I was a jerk to them. Yeah, sorry, Brian. But otherwise we had almost universal acceptance from these authors. And so we got all of their data. We invited everybody who wanted to be on the paper. We did a massive pre-registration where we pre-registered all aspects of what we're going to do with these meta-analyses. And indeed, we found two things, I think. There was remarkable consistency across studies. So we found almost no heterogeneity in effects. Universally across all the studies, there was no relation between how people felt at the daily level and whether or not they were likely to drink or how much they drank later that day. It just wasn't there. And on the other hand, we did find a really robust and consistent association between people feeling good on days before. And this is true if you even look before people started drinking, if you could sort of separate the drinking occasion from the emotions. And since then, I'd like to say we just settled that issue and everybody's like, okay, well, this affect regulation thing isn't true. But of course, when you show a null finding, everybody says, well, you got to do it differently. Even people who are in on the pre-registration would say like, well, this wasn't right. The affect regulation is really this, and this. So what we've been pursuing since then is a series of experimental studies and other EMA studies where we're trying to sort of knock off other variants of this hypothesis. So we have a grant that is, we just got a really good score on from NIAAA, where what we're proposing is to analyze, collect a new data set on affect and drinking and analyze it sort of every which way but loose. The idea is we're going to analyze it in what's called a multiverse analysis. We're going to collect data on daily affect and daily substance use from a large sample of people, and we're going to analyze it in over 1,000 different ways. And the idea, and then this idea with a multiverse analysis is you construct a curve of effects, and you can sort of see, okay, is there on average, is there evidence for this effect? And if there is, what are the sort of design or analytic factors that are driving the presence or absence of that effect? So it's been really fun, and I think it's been a both methodological challenge and also a really interesting sort of theoretical challenge for the field, trying to think about like, we believe this so strongly, and yet this one critical place, we can't find evidence for. So is it that it's not true, or we just never designed the study in the right way to find the way that it is true?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I've never heard of this multiverse analysis. Is kind of an interesting way to sort of do all of the possible post hoc or other research team analyses of your data sets, like all the different approaches that you may take, and then plotting those out to get sort of an average effect.
That's exactly what it is. And you take one research question and you think about all the choices you could make, right? So inclusion of covariates, the one caveat is it has to have the same ultimate estimand. So it has to all be an odds ratio or a regression coefficient or a correlation. Think about outliers. You think about how you measure the constructs, and you do all those analyses, you plot them, and then you run a permutation test where you do the same analyses, but where you shuffle the data so that you know that whatever correlation is in the data, whatever effect is in the data is completely generated at random. So you know that you've proved the null effect. Then you can compare the frequency of significant findings in your permutation data, and do that 500 times. Like, how often do you get, X number of, let's say 20% of the findings are significant in your observed data set. If your permutations test says, oh, when we shuffle the data, we only see that 5% of the ways we do it are significant, you can sort of be pretty confident that your 20% finding is not just because, you randomly are lucking into some findings. So it also gives you a sense, the way we think about it, it gives you a sense of what the literature is showing in general, right? Because your evidence suggests, well, analyzing it, our multiverse analysis says that, there's this, you get this effect 10% of the time, and the average effect is, whatever, 0.10. And you say, well, if we shuffle the data randomly, so we know the null hypothesis is true, and that's about what we get 10% of the time. And that sort of suggests that whatever, when you do see a significant effect in the literature where people only did it one way, that maybe we're sort of shouldn't be so confident in that finding.
That's so interesting. It reminds me of that paper, one of my favorite papers, Many Analysts, One Data Set, where they took 29 teams with 61 analysis. They gave them all the same data set and the same research question, and they asked them to answer that research question, and they found
tremendous variation.
Tremendous
variation of what people find and what they conclude. Sometimes the effects were in the opposite direction.
Effect sizes ranging from 0.89 to 2.93. With 69% of the teams finding positive effects and 31% finding negative, and so that's fascinating. All right, so I took this quiz from GameSpot. They have an article titled "The 25 Toughest Star Wars Trivia Questions."
Oh man,
got some easier ones in here. I've got some harder ones in here. Questions from you, and I'm going to be grading you on my own Star Wars related scale. The first question is, and this is a fill in the blank, where was Luke Skywalker originally headed to pick up power converters?
Oh, he was going to Tashi Station to pick up the power converters.
Yeah, that's right. You get that right, and so that you get 66 number of orders for that.
Ooh, that one hurts.
Yeah. Okay. Second question. What odds does C-3PO give Han for successfully navigating the asteroid field? And if you don't know this off the top of your head, I can give you multiple choice.
It's the ballpark. Yeah, it's a ballpark of 5 or 6 million to 1. But go ahead and give me the.
Okay, so the answers are 1,329 to 1, 3,720 to 1, 5,223,000 to 1, or the probability is so low that it can't be calculated.
No, it's the 5 million to 1. No, it's 3,000.
3,720 to 1.
Boy.
Unfortunately, you only get one Death Star out of 1 to 3 Death Stars for that answer.
Well, shouldn't it be one? It's like one Death Star, like a half Death Star still under construction, and then a Star Killer base, which is like a sort of pseudo Death Star retcon. Terrible.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and give you an extra Death Star for that correction. Yeah, I do have a bonus question for the C-3PO Han answer. So, true or false? You should always tell Han the odds.
Never tell him the odds.
Okay, false. Good. All right, so extra bonus point for that extra Death Star. Now you're up to 3 Death Stars.
Fantastic.
Another, I think, easy one. Then we're going to launch into some harder ones here. What does AT-AT stand for?
Oh, it's an all-terrain attack transport, I believe.
Oh, so close. All-terrain armored transport.
Armored transport. Oh, man.
I'm only going to give you 72% of the 93% possible of Rotten Tomatoes score.
And trivia for our listeners, an AT-AT is my white whale. That is the gift as a child that I always desired and never got until Mike Pullman, about 10 years ago, gave me a small toy AT-AT, which is still at my desk at work for my birthday.
This is true. All right, here's, I think, the harder questions, but we're going to see. What day is Wookiee Life Day, and where did we first learn about this holiday?
Oh, man. So I don't know the day. I'm going to say it's like June 4th, but hang on. But we first learned about it in the 1978 Christmas special for Star Wars, which was aired, and then my understanding was George Lucas tried to bury it because it was so bad. It was essentially a late 70s variety style show that took the Star Wars characters and had them all on a mission to get back to Kashyyyk for Life Day. And we met Boba Fett for the first time. This is the very first, I think it was in a cartoon. You meet Boba Fett before Empire Strikes Back came, and you also met Chewie's family, who, they have really crazy names and I can't remember, but you basically learned that the Wookiee species is extraordinarily unattractive and very, very funny looking.
Yeah, you know what? So I was going to give you 4 out of 8 sequels for that, but actually I'm going to boost that to 6 out of 8 because you did answer Kashyyyk, which was one of the questions I had, but I removed because I thought I wasn't sure how hard that would be. So that's excellent, man. You're really, really knocking them back here. You're definitely going to get me writing your out of office slide.
Fantastic! I can't wait.
Okay, here's another hard one, but you did really well on that one. Oh, the Wookiee Life Day is November 17th, so you got
Okay.
that part right.
Yeah, I had
Yes,
no clue what
definitely
that
from the
was.
Star Wars Holiday Special. Okay, in what movie does the camera pan back up after the crawl in the opening credits when they're showing and describing, describing the history? There's only one movie where the camera pans up rather than down.
Are we talking all 9 of these sort of original series? We're not talking
Yes,
any of the
original
other.
series.
Okay,
Original
because I was
series.
going to say Rogue One is. I actually believe they abandoned the. I think Rogue One might have been the first one where there's no ship over it, right? Because the trope is always there's a ship that they go off. I want to say I'm just going to guess off the top of my head. It's going to be Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith, where they go into the beginning of that. They go into sort of the battle over Coruscant, but I'm not confident in this answer.
I'm sorry, it's actually Episode 2, Attack of the Clones. For that one, you're going to get 0 racist tropes.
Oh, okay, I'll take that. Speaking of which, as an aside, if folks are interested, there's a really fantastic podcast called The Redemption of Jar Jar Binks. Really, really wonderful. And they talk about the notion of Jar Jar Binks being labeled as a racist trope and the origin of where Ahmed Best got the inspiration for Jar Jar Binks and how it felt to him to sort of be accused of playing on racist tropes, given sort of the background, the personal background that he has. I thought it was great. It's a really great episode, really great podcast series. Again, The Redemption of Jar Jar Binks.
Hey man, don't send people to other podcasts. We're just losing an audience here. All right, last question. You're doing super well. This one is Darth Vader's chest piece has some writing on it. What language is it in, and what does it translate to? And I can give you multiple choice if you need it.
Well, I'm going to guess that it's in binary, which is similar to the language of moisture evaporators. I don't know what it says, and maybe that's wrong. The thing I recall is like it's a series of straight lines and circles, so I'm just assuming it's like ones and zeros in binary, but I don't actually know.
Yeah, so here's your options. A, ancient Hebrew translates to, quote, his deeds will not be forgiven until he merits. B, ancient Egyptian translates to man cannot prevent darkness. C, Latin translates to don't remove the toy packaging. Or D, Gaelic translates to all life is servitude.
Oh man, I'm going to go with, I can't even envision the writing, so I'm going to guess it's Hebrew.
That's correct, and it translates to all his deeds will not be forgiven. That gives you 1,138 George Lucas references.
Ooh.
So, man, I'm gonna have to tally these up here. We've got.
If I could recommend, use percent of maximum possible scoring. That's what I sort of like to use. It's a classic paper by Cohen, Aiken, and
that
West.
is a good way to convert it to be one score. Yeah, well then you get 90%. So you've won me writing your next out of office.
Oh, I feel so excited.
I can
Thank
actually
you.
already tell you what it's going to say. It's going to say something like, "I'm Kevin King. I will be out of the office from January 1st to January 5th, and I will return an email response when I return to the office."
The best thing about that is, Mike, is it's going to be catch people completely by surprise because they're so used to my cleverness. When they sort of see that droll, or not droll, that sort of dull, uninspired out of office message, they'll know something's up. Thank you.
Exactly. We're running out of time here. Any shout outs you want to give?
Just to my students, you prepped me for a question of papers that don't get enough attention, and anything written by any trainee of mine, I think never, ever, ever gets enough attention. My students and my trainees are just amazing, and I'm so proud of everything that they do. And of course, I also want to thank my big inspiration in the field, Brian Weiner. I wouldn't be here without him.
Excellent. How can people reach you, Kevin?
They can Google my name, and I'm under the 3rd or 4th result after the football player and the magic comedian. And at one point, there was somebody who was convicted of murder who was also named Kevin King. That was a big thing early in my career. Someone, quote unquote. And you can also find me on Twitter and Blue Sky. Just search my name. I think on Twitter, I'm KMKing_psych, and on Blue Sky, I think I'm Kevin M. King.
All right, man. Thanks so much for talking with us today. I really appreciate it.
This was fantastic. Thanks again, Mike. I appreciate it.
Thanks so much for listening. If you liked today's podcast, post about it on social media, like, subscribe, share it with your friends and colleagues, or use your good mood to initiate a drinking episode, and make sure to mark it on your ecological momentary assessment. If you didn't like today's show, well, imagine the show had been done in as many different ways as you can, and then see if the existing show is better than that average. I'm on the social media platform formerly known as Twitter at ThatISPodcast, and Kevin is at KMKing_psych. All of the comments and opinions expressed during today's show are our own. They are well-reasoned and insightful, and therefore are probably not endorsed by our grant funders or employers. Thanks for listening. On behalf of Kevin King, we'll catch you next time.
Yeah, feel free to steer the conversation in whatever direction you want it to go,
Sure.
and I'll try to steer it back to whatever direction I want it to go.